Hey, everybody. We all know that parables are a way that Jesus communicated all kinds of different things, but what do they really mean and how should we read them? Today, Pastor Scott and I will be talking about just that on Valley Chat. Hey everyone, welcome back to Valley Chat. Pastor John Carolus here with Pastor Scott Seidler. And today we're talking about storytelling again, but storytelling in a very specific way, the ancient art of telling parables. Pastor Scott, can you give us a little bit of a background on parables, the role they played and what people really learned from them?
Yeah, parables are figurative stories. And so the Greek word for parable actually means to throw something at the wall, essentially up against the reality to which it refers. So a parable is a story that has some connection with reality, but is actually descriptive of a completely different reality that it represents. So a person in a parable represents a person we're familiar with, but also points to a person that is really the object or point of the story. So for instance, when a farmer goes out and sows seed in Jesus' parable, that farmer is someone we know, but that farmer represents God. The seed, which we know what seed looks like, but that seed is not actual seed. It represents the gospel. That's what a parable is meant to do. And by doing that, it sears into our memory a very vivid or visual image, but from a different, context.
And did Jesus ever, tell parables that would have referred to maybe common stories of the culture, where, not only does everyone know a farmer, but everyone knows the story about the farmer who blank, kind of grew up hearing those stories. Would Jesus ever sort of draw in those familiar stories and kind of bring new teachings to light through that? Is that
100%. Yeah. So again, it's not just the point of reference that is the farmer or the seed, but everybody understands that when you throw seed onto rocky soil, there is a certain outcome. So there is the entities, so to speak, within the parable. And then there is the action or the experience of how those entities interrelate to each other in the parable, and then as an extension into the real life point that is attempted to be made.
And all the gospel writers captured a number of Jesus' parables.
Right.
So clearly there's a lot there for us to dig into. As someone who maybe isn't super familiar with reading the Bible or hasn't done a lot of it on their own, sometimes when you read a parable, it's like, what is the hidden meaning here? Is there one singular hidden meaning? Is there a lesson I can learn new each time I come back to it?
Right.
How does someone navigate whether there's one specific answer or there's more than one thing to learn?
So in any time we talk, in any speech act, there are two things simultaneously happening. There is disclosure, and then there is concealment. And so a parable discloses certain things about a reality to which it is pointing through the use of what I'll at least say is figurative language. So there's disclosure. At the same time, there is not, kind of like Spock in Star Trek, there's not a Vulcan mind meld where everything that could be disclosed is actually being disclosed. Sometimes the parables depend on the culture, filling in blanks. Like, for instance, the woman who looks for the lost coin. You have to know what it's like to be a woman who loses a coin in that culture to really appreciate what is being disclosed there. So there is sometimes intentional concealment. That is to say, the parable writer chooses not to, or Jesus in this case, chooses not to add in certain information in order to maybe make the parable a little bit more climactic, a little bit more mysterious. Sometimes the concealment is not intentional. It's just part of the culture in which the parable is being expressed. And you have to fill in cultural blanks that living in that culture, you're expected to know. So again, disclosure, concealment, those are two axes that every story revolves around, but parables especially.
And Jesus does a couple of interesting things where he will speak a parable to a specific audience with a specific intent. And then there's others that are spoken to these large crowds. And it almost feels like the ones spoken to to particular audiences have a little bit more of an edge to them, a little bit more of a cut to them. And then the general ones are just that. They're a little bit more general. And so you can sort of not necessarily see yourself as a character in the parable. So, talking about the sower and the seeds, casting the seeds on these different places, different kinds of soil.
Right.
I can sort of abstractly see myself as a kind of soil, or I should strive to be the good soil.
Yep.
But I don't necessarily relate to different kinds of terrain.
Right.
The way that I would relate to someone who's lost something and is trying desperately to find it, or
Sure.
even, an animal that's been lost and is being sought by its shepherd.
Yeah.
Which brings us to sort of the parable we're talking about today. The parable of the prodigal son, as it's often called, appears in Luke 15, right after the lost sheep and the lost coin. Who is Jesus speaking this parable to? And what is sort of the general point of all of these parables in line with each other?
So, I'm just going to say this by way of summary for what you just said. Determining your location as a reader relative to the parable that you're reading is an essential task. In other words, am I in the parable, and therefore the parable essentially applies to me directly as a participant in it? Am I the rocky soil? Am I the fertile ground? That kind of thing. Or is my location outside the parable, and I'm watching Jesus speak this parable to people inside the parable, right? So in this case, we're going to get to the prodigal son and the brother who stayed, and I am meant to react to the parable as an observer, but not as a participant. So I hope that makes sense. Which brings us then to Luke 15, the essential story that is well known throughout the Western literary canon. And that is, a young man decides he wants to take his share of the inheritance and go and live out on his own, free from the constraints of his father and his family and the home that he grew up in. And so he takes the money from the father. He goes out, he squanders it, we are told, on wild living. After a while, he decides, I'm living horribly. I'm not a happy camper. This is not all that it's cracked up to be. I can live much better as a slave in my father's house than I can by living on my own out here. And so he determines to go back. The father, who had been waiting for him miraculously, sees this now prodigal son coming from a distance, opens up the house, throws a big party, kills the fattened calf, puts on rings and cloaks and all manner of things, and welcomes this son who was lost but now is found. Oh, amazing grace. Welcomes him home. All the while, the brother who stayed behind is very upset about this because he feels like, look, I didn't get to go out and live a wild life, free and clear of your expectations. And now it's as if I'm chopped liver, and here we are. So what do we do, John, with this parable? What are some options for us? Let's go through all the options for reading this parable and applying it to our lives.
Yes, if we did an exhaustive list, I'm sure we could be here for hours. We won't do that to you, but we will talk about the popular ones, right? One is to imagine yourself as the prodigal son, and we've all been there in terms of trying to go our own way, thinking we have things figured out, imagining that it's riches, whatever those riches might be. Maybe it's financial riches, maybe it's time, resources, allowing yourself to have time, or just experiential richness, and thinking that that's what it's all about. And if you go and accumulate that, then you will have life figured out and you'll enjoy it to the full.
Yeah.
And only to find out that those things will leave you empty. Mm-hmm. Another option is to focus on how the father's action is one of going out to both of his sons. Jesus says that the father runs to the son from a distance. That would have been culturally unusual. That would have been a little bit embarrassing to the father to be running as an elder in the community. And then also he goes out to the older son who is standing outside of the party. He's sending a servant to figure out what's going on there. And then the father comes out to him. And so we hear about the graciousness of the father. And one that is, I think, gaining popularity is putting yourself in the shoes of the older son, which is you've remained relatively faithful to the family. You haven't asked rudely for your inheritance before it's time. You've been a diligent worker. You've been getting your things done. And yet when there's rejoicing at the return of the prodigal, it actually makes you more upset, right, and feeling more slighted, right, than and unable to participate in the rejoicing of that great return.
Yep. So, to again go back to what we were talking about right before we got into this actual particular parable, what you're saying is there are a lot of options and locations in the parable.
Yeah, to put yourself in.
The son that left, the prodigal, the son that stayed, the experience of the father, what is the squandering that was done? What is the motivation for being just stingy, the older son? And man, you can spend a lot of time in those locations. I want to ask you, where do you find yourself? I will ask that question. I will answer my question because I don't like to put John on the spot. I would say
Is that true?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
No, not at all. I would say my space early on in my Christian life was certainly the place of the prodigal. God welcomes me. Wow, I am so thankful and grateful for his unbounding mercy. The older I get, the more crusty, maybe because of just the scar tissue that comes through ministry. It is easy for me to get a little bit chippy with those who are, I don't know, maybe not, I don't feel working so hard or whatever. And now that I'm a grandfather, I have much more of a sense with my adult children what it means to be the father that runs and in advance, so that they never have to be afraid to come home and ask for help or advice or anything like that. It's a fascinating journey, and parables are like that. They invite you to embody many different aspects, but from a location within. What about you, John?
Yeah, I would agree. I think early on, it seems like at first blush, you are the prodigal son. The reader is the prodigal. You're
right.
The one that's been lost. And eventually you should come to your senses and return home, where even being a servant is better
right.
than abandonment on your own in a dangerous world. But as someone with a younger brother, there always was a draw for me to the older brother. And sometimes I think there are seasons where I imagined he was in the right, even in his insolence, even in his defensiveness or frustration.
Right.
And now, as a pastor, I think there's another a level of temptation to be the older brother in that judgment of those who haven't been around the faith or the church that long, people who haven't had this walk with God that in my life has been present before I had conscious memory. And so to look at somebody whose journey has begun far more recently and think, why is it that they're experiencing such blessing or such happiness or such joy? Don't they know the trials of faith? And that's the point of the older son is you have everything that the Father has to give.
Right.
You have everything, and it's all around you. And don't fall into the temptation to reject the one when they come home from their disobedience. And this,
right.
We got into this with a small group that we're involved with, where the older brother accuses the younger brother of having misspent the father's fortunes.
Right.
And he lost that forever. Mm-hmm. And so he's mad that he's lost the father's treasures. And the father never confuses his material possessions for his treasure.
Right.
His treasures are his sons.
Yeah. Wow.
And
great.
So
I love that.
What the father lost was not his fortune.
Yeah.
He was going to give that away anyways.
Right.
What he lost was his son. And so in his son coming home, great rejoicing is to be had.
Yeah.
And so now the invitation is, how can I participate in the rejoicing of a lost one coming home?
Yeah.
And if you would, bring us into Jesus' preaching of this. He's talking to religious leaders, right?
Well, so here's the deal. So I'm going to answer two questions. The first one that you just asked, which is, he's talking not to religious leaders, he's talking in the context of religious leaders. So if you go back to the beginning of Luke chapter 15, you see these religious leaders who are basically grumpy that Jesus is hanging out with sinners. And he's doing stuff that they find to be rather, I don't know, a detraction from the holiness that the church should enjoy and expect of its participants. So I don't know if he's preaching to religious leaders, or if he's preaching to his disciples. But this is true for those in that location in the moment. He's preaching in the context of all of them. And so as we've been talking about, how do we, as we listen to this parable, put ourselves in particular places within the parable? Does that make sense? That makes sense. Mm-hmm. So now the second question, though, is this. So Jesus is saying this parable, but there's another person who's telling this parable, and that person is Matthew. 30 years or so later, Matthew decides he's going to write a gospel. And he says, scratches his head, hey, I think, you know what, a good parable that I should really relate, or not Matthew, Luke. Luke, 30 years later, is writing this gospel, and he's saying, you know what, I think I should tell this parable. And the question is, well, why, Luke, of all the parables you could tell, did you choose this parable to tell? And part of the reason is because Luke has decided that it is important for the church of his time, and potentially the church leaders of his time, to see this behavior of Jesus in his telling of the parable as a way to counteract false teachers in the church. And so this goes to the location question. So either you're in the parable, prodigal, older brother, dad, or you're outside the parable and now you're making judgments. This may be a little bit too fine of a point about the reality of the church. And so, John, you and I are pastors, and we look at the whole gamut of the church worldwide, particularly in America, particularly here in Scottsdale. And we see that there are people in the church who are both welcoming and antagonistic to outsiders, who are both welcoming and condemning or judging of fellow sinners, who either honor the Father or by their behavior bring dishonor on the Father. And we as pastors who are outside of those experiences, but we're observers, what do we do with all of that? How does that constrain our ministry, the way that we manage a church, a congregation, how we have breakfast, lunch, or coffee with sinners that come and want some help or assistance? And so it goes full circle. There are a lot of different places from which we can enjoy and benefit from this parable. And I just don't want to lose, for me right now, the outsider status to the parable as much as I equally am an insider.
Yeah, and I think, too, there is this opportunity for us with this parable speaking directly into our mission to connect every person in every season, to pay attention to the season that we're interacting with or speaking into.
Right.
The season you're in isn't the season I'm in, isn't the season that the person listening in is in, or the neighbors of that person are in.
Right.
And so this parable sort of comprehensive approach to where is God's move toward you coming from, where are you at, is beautiful. And
I would say, one of the key themes throughout Luke's gospel is a theme of what is called table fellowship. That is, where good things are happening and where your real sociology is on the basis of who are the people you're eating with. Mm-hmm. And so it cannot be understated that the Father's desire to throw a feast not only connects with, we're celebrating the prodigal's back, but it connects with the entire purpose of Luke's gospel, which is the church is a place, and it is pastored by people who create a welcoming table for all comers. That includes, by the way, the prodigals. Those are easy, honestly, but it also has to figure out a way to be a place for the sons who remain, the religious leaders who scowl. They should be called back as much as possible into a space of grace and compassion and mercy and acceptance, never violating the moral code and compass of God, our Heavenly Father, but at the same time recognizing forgiveness and mercy is at the heart of table fellowship by our God and by the Lord Jesus Christ when he's on the ground in 33 AD.
We had just had a conversation around things we're reading. So I'll close today with a invitation to consider a book that has come across my desk, I don't know, 18 months ago. It's written by a guy named Isaac Slater. He's a monk in New York.
Another monk.
He's another monk.
Another monk.
This book is really good, and it's, I think, challenging for the Lutheran mind.
Yeah.
And as a middle child antagonist, I love being challenged. So it's called Do Not Judge Anyone. And it sort of invites this very patient, how did the father get the son back home? Giving him everything he wanted so he could find out that that was an empty well. Right. And at the same time, what's his approach to the son who obeyed and obeyed in judgment of the other brother? Still going out to him and meeting him. So kind of capturing that heart and inviting us to participate in that work of the Father as well. Whether you read it or not, we still love you. You're still welcome here at Shepherd. Thanks for listening to today's conversation, and we look forward to the next conversation with you here on Valley Chat.
Love it.